Nixon declared a vision of peace with honor. But what if that vision was just a mirage? In 1971, South Vietnamese forces undertook a daring invasion into Laos without any American soldiers setting foot across the border. Their aim? To sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Instead, it became a harsh examination of Vietnamization and a stark revelation of how reliant South Vietnam remained on American military support. This is the lesser-known account of Operation Lam Son 719, a moment when silence from Washington met the thunder of North Vietnamese tanks. In the 1968 presidential election, Richard M. Nixon ascended to power, vowing to secure peace with honor in Vietnam. Once he took office in January 1969, he tasked his administration with a mission to pull back from Vietnam. After extensive discussions, he declared in June, alongside South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, that the U.S. would gradually hand the reins of the war to South Vietnamese forces as American troops withdrew. This initiative was dubbed Vietnamization, aimed at enhancing the capabilities of the South Vietnamese military to enable them to take charge as U.S. forces exited. The first significant challenge of Vietnamization came in the spring of 1970, when Nixon directed an assault into North Vietnamese safe havens in Cambodia. This operation involved a coalition of 32,000 American troops and 48,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. The primary thrust was executed by units from the 1st Cavalry Division, 25th Infantry Division, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese troops pushed into the Parrot's Beak area. Both offensives were successful, with Allied forces discovering and dismantling numerous large communist base camps and seizing a substantial cache of supplies. Throughout this operation, the South Vietnamese, bolstered by U.S. artillery, air support, and helicopter gunships, performed admirably, achieving all their assigned objectives. Nixon proclaimed that the success of South Vietnamese forces in Cambodia was visible proof of the success of Vietnamization. While the incursion into Cambodia may have provided temporary relief for the Allies, it had an unexpected outcome. Stripped of their sanctuaries in Cambodia, Hanoi was compelled to rely solely on cross-country routes through Laos for resupplying its troops in the south. To counteract the loss of the Sihanoukville overland route and the significant amounts of supplies taken by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces during the Cambodian invasion, the Communists launched an expansive initiative to enhance the capabilities of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was far more than just a single road. It was an intricate network of trails, bicycle paths, and roads, some of which could support heavy truck, tank, and armored vehicle traffic, along with base camps and storage facilities. By 1971, it extended from North Vietnam through the Mu Gia, Ban Karai, and Ban Raving passes in the Annamite Mountains into Chapon and Muang Nong in Laos, right across the border from Khe San in Quang Tri Province. From two primary base areas in this section, designated 604 and 611, the trail ran south towards several other base areas along South Vietnam's 1,300-kilometer border with Laos and Cambodia. After the war, North Vietnamese leaders proudly claimed they had constructed over 13,000 kilometers of trails and roads as part of this extensive system, all built, maintained, and defended by Transportation Group 559, with the effort of around 100,000 NVA and Laotian volunteers and forced laborers. U.S. intelligence figures indicated that between 1966 and 1971, roughly 630,000 NVA troops, along with 100,000 tons of food, 400,000 weapons, and 50,000 tons of ammunition, traveled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam. Following the Allied invasion of Cambodia, the NVA took further action to not just enhance the trail, but also to strengthen it, ensuring it could operate without disruption from U.S. or South Vietnamese forces. In the fall of 1970, 20 anti-aircraft battalions were deployed to Laos to provide aerial protection for the trail against Allied aircraft. These new units were armed with a variety of advanced weaponry, including 12.7 mm and 14.5 mm machine guns, 23 mm cannons, and over 200 anti-aircraft guns of different calibers. This bolstered the air defense capabilities significantly over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In addition to deploying air defense units, other NVA combat units were also sent to Laos to safeguard this crucial supply route, raising the estimated communist troop presence in Laos to around 22,000, including 7,000 NVA combat troops. Troops, including 10,000 in logistics and support roles and 5,000 from the Communist Pathet Lao, were all organized under a new command known as the 70B Corps, which took operational control of the 304th, 308th, and 320th NVA divisions. Intelligence reports suggested that, by the end of 1970, the NVA was infiltrating around 6,000 combat troops through Laos down the trail into South Vietnam each month. Alongside the increasing infiltration, U.S. intelligence noted a significant stockpiling of weapons, ammunition, and equipment in Base Area 604 near Chapone. Additionally, there were indications that the North Vietnamese were focused on restoring their sanctuaries in Cambodia. President Nixon and his military advisors were deeply concerned about the escalating situation in Laos and the renewed enemy activities in Cambodia. If action was not taken, the North Vietnamese would soon be in a position to directly threaten Quang Tri, the northernmost province in South Vietnam. A short march from Base Area 611 through the A Shau Valley could easily lead to an attack on the historic capital of Hue. Intelligence analysts speculated that the arrival of troops and new weaponry in Laos and Cambodia might be a preparation for a communist offensive against the two northern provinces in South Vietnam, potentially in early 1971, or more likely in the U.S. election year of 1972, when fewer than 50,000 U.S. troops would remain in South Vietnam, and Nixon would be focused on his re-election campaign. The president faced a dilemma similar to when the communists threatened Phnom Penh. He needed to take action regarding the North Vietnamese in Laos to prevent the buildup from undermining Vietnamization and plans for U.S. withdrawal from Southeast Asia. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, he understood that he couldn't delay, as U.S. strength and combat presence in the region were diminishing daily, and he doubted that the South Vietnamese could manage on their own. After reviewing a series of studies commissioned in November 1970, Nixon concluded that his only viable option was a preemptive strike against the communists. The challenge was determining where to launch the attack. An initial consideration was an amphibious assault targeting Vinh in North Vietnam. Kissinger suggested repeating the Cambodian incursion to leverage the progress made in the earlier operation. Nixon dispatched General Alexander Haig to Saigon to discuss this idea with General Creighton Abrams, the commander of MACV, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, and South Vietnamese President Teo. In their discussions, they all concurred with Kissinger's view that a new Allied offensive was urgently needed. General Abrams proposed a bold operation that included a primary attack into Laos to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, along with a secondary attack into Cambodia. He contended that if the communist supply routes could be disrupted in Laos and Cambodia, even for a single dry season, it would significantly hinder, if not entirely halt, their capacity for a large-scale offensive in South Vietnam for the foreseeable future. Thus, he suggested a plan where U.S. forces would establish blocking positions along the DMZ and set up a forward support base near the border to back a South Vietnamese assault into Laos aimed at seizing Chapone. This attack would be succeeded by operations to search for and destroy communist bases and disrupt traffic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A smaller operation in Cambodia would target a new enemy base being established close to the Chup rubber plantation near Military Region 3. Haig returned to Washington and shared Abrams's plan with Kissinger and the president. According to Kissinger, Nixon was immediately on board with the plan, but he wanted to avoid being caught off guard by critics as he had been the previous year over Cambodia. Therefore, he started working to build a consensus for the offensive among his advisors, arranging a series of briefings for his key staff and cabinet members individually. On December 23rd, Haig briefed Nixon once more, this time with Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird present. Following the briefing, Nixon expressed his support for the proposed operation to Laird and asked him to investigate the plan during his upcoming trip to Saigon in early January. Kissinger noted that Laird endorsed the idea of a cross-border operation to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, arguing that it could provide at least a year's advantage and that a successful major offensive by the South Vietnamese without U.S. ground support would clearly demonstrate the success of Vietnamization. On December 21, 1970, Nixon gave the green light to the Laos operation in principle, pending final review before it could move forward. Shortly after, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized General Abrams to reach out to General Vien, the head of the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff, to begin planning and coordination for the Laos Initiative. A subsequent message instructed Abrams to devise contingency plans for a cross-border operation by South Vietnamese forces into Laos via Route 9, just south of the demilitarized zone. This operation would be supported by American air and naval forces, alongside a concurrent South Vietnamese assault into Cambodia aimed at dismantling a major enemy base developing in the Chup rubber plantation. However, because of the Cooper Church Amendment passed after the Cambodian incursion, American ground troops were prohibited from crossing into Laos, and no advisors could accompany the ARVN units during the attack. U.S. support would be limited to close air support, helicopter assistance, and long-range artillery from South Vietnamese bases along the border. Still, the president was confident that the ARVN could successfully carry out these attacks with the backing of the American combat forces that remained at the start of 1971. Admiral Moorer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, assured him that the South Vietnamese could carry out the mission, provided they had American air support. The South Vietnamese were also optimistic. General Abrams had briefed President Thieu and the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff in early December, reporting that Thieu reacted positively and believed the operation should proceed. While Matt CV developed the contingency plans, Nixon and his aides continued to deliberate on the proposed operations. After Laird returned from Saigon, the president convened a meeting in the Oval Office on January 18, 1971, which included Kissinger, Laird, Haig, Moorer, Secretary of State William Rogers, and Richard Helms, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Laird shared insights from his trip and discussions with Abrams, Bunker, and Thieu. During an almost 3-hour briefing, he reviewed the military and political landscape in South Vietnam and detailed the planned operations in Laos and Cambodia. The ensuing discussion revealed a consensus that, if successful, this campaign could disrupt the North Vietnamese buildup and delay their operations. Any planned general offensive by the Communists would buy at least 6 more months for the Vietnamization program to advance, allowing U.S. troop withdrawals to stay on track while deterring the Communists from taking further action. Additionally, Nixon believed a successful operation might persuade the Communists to negotiate sincerely and emphasized that these operations could be crucial in the overall conduct of the war. Another important element in the discussions was that, as Admiral Moorer noted earlier, this operation was the last chance for South Vietnam to launch a significant strike against enemy sanctuaries while American forces were still available for support. Haig later mentioned that those who briefed the president on this plan were hopeful about its success, but they all recognized that the essential factor was robust U.S. military backing for the ARVN. This comment sheds light on the prevailing views regarding the Vietnamization process. However, as General Haig pointed out in his memoirs, the success of Vietnamization wasn't really about its military effectiveness. It was successful not in Vietnam, but in the United States, where, as Secretary of Defense Laird and his supporters had intended, it diminished opposition to the war in Congress and the media by presenting a program that promised a clear end to American casualties. Yet, fewer American casualties had little to do with the military power of South Vietnam's armed forces. Nonetheless, Nixon tentatively approved moving forward with detailed planning for the cross-border operation into Laos, designated Lam Son 719. As military planning progressed, Kissinger began to have reservations about the operation. On January 25th, he met with Admiral Moorer. Kissinger speculated that the Chapon area was so vital to the North Vietnamese resupply efforts that they would certainly fight fiercely to keep it. Worried about the potential for high casualties among South Vietnamese forces, He questioned whether the ARVN could manage on their own without U.S. advisors and air support on the ground. Maurer assured him that the South Vietnamese were capable of executing the attack and that U.S. air power could effectively isolate the battlefield to maintain manageable force ratios. He relayed his discussions with Maurer in a memo to the president and arranged for Maurer to speak with Nixon the following day. When Maurer met with the president, he was firm in his reassurances, asserting that the operation was solid and that decisive outcomes were likely. While Nixon was persuaded by these assertions, Secretary of State Rogers had reservations. During a meeting on January 29th, he urged the president to rethink his decision, suggesting that the operation was too dangerous. He noted that when General Westmoreland, as MAPV commander, had assessed a similar operation, he estimated it would require 4 U.S. divisions to succeed. The current plan relied on significantly fewer South Vietnamese troops. Therefore, Rogers believed an ARVN defeat was almost inevitable, fearing it could irreparably harm the Vietnamization effort. He also thought Nixon's congressional opponents would argue that the operation violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Cooper Church Amendment. Kissinger noted that Nixon had already considered most of Rogers' concerns and felt the Secretary of State simply did not know what he was talking about. The president decided to proceed with the operation, and on February 4, 1971, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued the official order. Lam Son 719 was planned as a joint RVNAF-U.S. operation conducted under numerous constraints. No joint command was set up for the operation's oversight. The ground commander for the operation in Laos was Lieutenant Gen Hong Xuan Lam, who led the ARVN's I Corps. His U.S. counterpart, Lieutenant Gen James W. Sutherland, who commanded the 14th Corps, would oversee all U.S. Army forces involved and coordinate support for the operation. General Lucius D. Clay, Jr., commander of the 7th Air Force, would oversee all U.S. Air Force resources supporting the mission. This campaign was designed as a spoiling attack, intended more to disrupt the enemy's plans than to capture and hold territory. The goal of Operation Lam Son 719 was to seize Base Area 604 in the Chepon area, located at a key supply route junction along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, approximately 50 kilometers from the South Vietnam border. After securing Chepon, for the rest of the dry season, the South Vietnamese would focus on disrupting the trail and demolishing supply facilities in the region. The actual invasion of Laos would kick off on February 8th and run for 90 days, until the monsoon rains would inevitably limit operations. This assault would feature some of the best troops from the ARVN, including the 1st Division, the 1st Armored Brigade, 3 Ranger battalions from I Corps, along with the elite Airborne and Marine divisions from the Joint General Staff's Strategic Reserve. Initially, 16,000 South Vietnamese soldiers would participate in the operation, a number that would later rise to 20,000 with reinforcements. About 10,000 U.S. combat and engineering troops would provide support from Quang Tri Province. The operation was divided into 4 phases. In Phase 1, the 1st Brigade of the U.S. 5th Infantry Division was tasked with clearing and securing Route 9 from Dong Ha to the Laotian border. They would also secure Fire Support Base Vandegrift, an abandoned U.S. Marine base, along with Khe Sanh, where a headquarters would be established to coordinate helicopter assaults, close air support, long-range artillery fire, and logistics. The U.S. 45th Engineer Group would be responsible for repairing the airfield at Khe Sanh to accommodate C-130 flights, and would also fix Route 9 leading to the Laotian border. As the 1st Brigade of the 5th Infantry Division executed their mission, the U.S. 101st Airborne Division would take over the operational area of the ARVN 1st Infantry Division in Quang Tri and Thu Thien provinces, while the ARVN moved into Laos. Additional U.S. forces would secure the regions south of the DMZ and next to the Vietnamese-Laotian border. An ARVN task force from the 1st Armored Brigade would follow the 1st Brigade's advance, moving northwest to protect the northern flank once Khe Sanh was secure. The U.S. effort during Phase 1 was codenamed Dewey Canyon 2. Simultaneously, 6,500 troops from the ARVN 1st Airborne Division and 3,000 troops from the Vietnamese Marine Corps were to be positioned in the I Corps area. These forces would be airlifted by U.S. Air Force cargo planes to airfields in Quang Tri and Dong Ha. The entire Phase 1 operation was anticipated to take 5 to 8 days to finish. Once U.S. forces secured Route 9 in South Vietnam, South Vietnamese forces would advance to occupy assembly areas and set up attack positions near the Laotian border close to Khe Sanh and Lao Bao. Phase 2 would kick off with a three-pronged assault by the ARVN heading west along the highway towards Chapone, with support from the 7th U.S. Air Force for close air support and U.S. 14 Corps helicopters alongside long-range artillery. The main advance along the highway would be spearheaded by the ARVN Airborne Division, bolstered by the 1st Armored Brigade. This assault would involve ground movements and successive heliborne assaults, ultimately targeting the capture of Aloi, the junction of routes 9 and 92. After securing the initial objective, the Airborne Division would execute an air assault into Chapone, while armored units pressed forward by road to connect with the airborne forces in Chapone. To safeguard the flanks of the principal attack, the South Vietnamese 1st Infantry Division would launch a parallel offensive in the south, establishing fire bases on high ground south of Route 9 between Aloi and Chapone. In the north, the South Vietnamese 1st Ranger Group would conduct helicopter assaults to create blocking positions to prevent enemy forces from moving south and hindering the main assault along the highway. The attack helicopters from the U.S. 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry, Air were tasked with locating and neutralizing anti-aircraft weapons, identifying enemy concentrations, and performing reconnaissance and security roles, including rescuing downed air crews in Laos. A Vietnamese Marine Brigade would remain on standby at Khe Sanh. 2 days before Phase 2 commenced, U.S. tactical air operations were set to initiate an intense campaign to suppress enemy air defenses, which would last between 3 to 7 days. Phase 3, following the capture of Chapone, would see the South Vietnamese conducting search and destroy missions in Base Area 604 and throughout the territories south of Chapone. The 1st Airborne Division would establish blocking positions to the northwest of Chapone along Route 91 and southeast along Route 9 to encircle the area. Simultaneously, the 1st Infantry Division would carry out search and destroy operations in its designated zone just south of the Zipan River, while the 1st Ranger Group would maintain its blocking and screening efforts on the northern flank. The ARVN forces would be limited to a corridor no more than 15 miles wide on either side of Route 9, extending no deeper than Chapone. Phase 4, the final stage, focused on the withdrawal of South Vietnamese forces from Laos. This withdrawal could occur in one of two ways, based on the circumstances at the time. The first option involved the Airborne Division pulling back directly east along Route 9 to support an attack to the southeast into Base Area 611 by the 1st Infantry Division as they returned to South Vietnam. The second option called for a joint attack by both divisions into Base Area 611. Both approaches included plans for RVNF elements to remain behind and disrupt enemy activities in Base Areas 604 and 611 after the main South Vietnamese troops withdrew. Additionally, the plan featured a deception phase. To mislead the North Vietnamese about the main offensive, a naval task force carrying U.S. Marines from the 31st Marine Amphibious Unit, along with 2 aircraft carriers, would operate in the Tonkin Gulf, 70 kilometers off the port city of Vinh in North Vietnam. The objective of this task force was to simulate an amphibious assault on Vinh, diverting North Vietnamese focus as the South Vietnamese forces entered Laos. This tactic seemingly worked, as the task force captured the attention of the North Vietnamese High Command, providing the South Vietnamese attackers with a few days of relief from a significant NVA reinforcement effort in Laos. Due to concerns of communist espionage within the RVNAF High Command, Abrams instructed that the number of personnel involved in the joint planning be kept to an absolute minimum. Units participating in the operation were not informed until January 17th, and the Airborne Division, designated to lead the assault, received detailed plans only on February 2nd, just days before the scheduled D-Day on February 8th. Despite these precautions, later evidence indicated that NVA agents had infiltrated the I Corps staff and had access to detailed operation plans. To avoid premature media coverage of the mission, Matv briefed American reporters off the record about the upcoming campaign and briefly restricted reporting on troop movements until the operation officially commenced. This turned out to be a poor choice because the embargo itself signaled an impending operation. Although the embargo was lifted on February 4th, news had already leaked, sparking speculation in both U.S. and international newspapers about an impending Allied attack into Laos. Despite the challenges in keeping the operation under wraps, U.S. and ARVN commanders maintained a hopeful outlook on the ambitious plan's success. Colonel Arthur W. Pence, the senior advisor to the ARVN Airborne Division, later remarked, "At this moment, it was clear that intelligence believed the operation would face minimal resistance. They anticipated that 2 days of tactical air preparation before D-Day would effectively neutralize the enemy's anti-aircraft capabilities, even though the enemy was reported to have between 170 and 200 anti-aircraft weapons in the operational area. The threat from tanks was seen as minimal, and the capability for reinforcements was estimated at 14 days for 2 divisions from north of the DMZ. Both U.S. and ARVN commanders seemed to be emboldened by the moderate success of the Cambodian incursion. However, 3 key differences between the Laos attack and the Cambodian operation would significantly impact the outcome of LAM Son 719. While it was planned as a combined operation with the 14 U.S. Corps providing logistical support, long-range artillery, and helicopters, U.S. personnel were barred from ground operations in Laos. This meant that not only would there be no U.S. combat troops accompanying ARVN forces as there were in Cambodia, but also that no U.S. advisors would accompany the South Vietnamese into Laos. This marked a pivotal moment, as most ARVN forces would now head into battle without their American counterparts. Once they crossed into Laos, the South Vietnamese would be left to fend for themselves against the NVA. The second significant difference between the Laotian operation and the Cambodian incursion was the terrain and, to a large extent, the weather, which would heavily influence the battle's outcome. While the terrain in Cambodia had been relatively manageable, the area targeted for LAM Son 719 was rugged, thickly overgrown, and lined with double canopy jungle along the Zipon River, which ran parallel to Route 9 to the south. Route 9 was basically an underdeveloped road, hardly more than a dirt path in several areas. It was flanked by elevated ground, which gave the NVA excellent defensive positions. Weather also played a crucial role. By the time the operation commenced, the northeast monsoon would be winding down, resulting in less than ideal flying conditions that often restricted helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft operations. On top of that, the region was likely to experience intermittent, sometimes heavy rainfall that could hinder the movement of armored vehicles. Therefore, both the terrain and the weather were not favorable for the attackers in this mission. The third major difference between LAM Son 719 and the operation in Cambodia was that, despite intelligence reports suggesting otherwise, the enemy decided to stay and engage. After the battle, it became clear that the NVA had suspected an ARVN offensive into Laos near military region funds and had started making preparations as early as October 1970. They set up defensive structures, designated ambush sites, pre-registered artillery on likely Allied landing zones, and moved supplies and ammunition. When the ARVN initiated their operation, there were more than 22,000 NVA troops in the area around Chapone. Hanoi ordered that Base Area 604 be defended and sent additional reinforcements, raising the total number of enemy troops in the vicinity to over 36,000. By the end of the campaign, the North Vietnamese would unleash elements from 5 divisions, supported by armor and artillery. Gen. Bruce Palmer noted that Abrams was well aware of the risks posed by the differences between the Cambodian incursion and LAM Son 719. It might have felt like sending a boy to do a man's job in a very hostile setting, but the U.S. commander was relying heavily on B-52 strikes, U.S. tactical air support, and the mobility provided by U.S. assault helicopters with armed escorts to level the playing field for the South Vietnamese. Palmer later described the situation as a big gamble. A failure could seriously undermine Vietnamization and either extend the presence of U.S. forces in Vietnam or create pressure at home that might lead the United States to abandon its struggling ally. If it succeeded, it would greatly enhance the morale of the South Vietnamese and affirm the Vietnamization process. However, if things went awry, it would spell disaster for both South Vietnam and the United States. On January 29th, at 4 in the morning, U.S. forces launched Phase 1 of the operation. The 1st Brigade of the 5th U.S. Mechanized Infantry Division started clearing South Vietnam from Route 9 up to the DMZ. Additional American troops reoccupied the fire base at Khe Sanh, while the 45th Engineers began repairing the damaged airstrip. Simultaneously, more U.S. forces secured Route 9 toward the border and began fixing the road. By February 5th, most tasks had been completed, and U.S. forces took over the security for the ARVN assembly areas near the border. The lead ARVN forces, made up of the 1st Armor Brigade, along with 2 South Vietnamese airborne battalions and the 11th and 17th Cavalry Regiments, crossed the start line right on schedule at 7 a.m. on February 8, 1971. Sadly, on February 6th, bad weather forced the cancellation of airstrikes meant to neutralize NVA anti-aircraft guns along Route 9. Despite this setback, the 4,000-man armored column launched an attack to the west along the route as planned. Led by M41 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers, they pushed 9 kilometers into Laos on the first day, but were slowed down by thick jungle and large bomb craters along the route that hindered their advance. The road itself was in poor condition, and the ARVN 101st Combat Engineer Battalion was forced to build detours where it was completely destroyed, which further delayed the armored column's progress. Meanwhile, the airborne forces on the northern flank attacked their first objectives amidst sporadic enemy resistance. The ARVN 1st Infantry Division on the southern flank also achieved its initial objectives with minimal enemy contact. It was later found that Gen Disuo, Vong Nguyen Giap, and the commander of 70B Corps were holding back their forces until they could determine if the ARVN assault along Route 9 was a genuine attack or merely a diversion for the main offensive elsewhere. By February 9th, they concluded that the Route 9 offensive was indeed the main strike, prompting the commander of 70B Corps to order the 308th Iron Division, stationed near the DMZ, to move toward Route 9 to bolster the NVA units already present there. Moreover, the North Vietnamese leadership directed the 2nd NVA Division to relocate from their positions further south to the Chaponi area, aiming to hinder the South Vietnamese armored column along Route 9. Heavy rainfall transformed Route 9 into a muddy mess, making it even harder for the South Vietnamese forces to advance. Still, by February 10th, the attackers reached their initial target, Aloi, connecting with an airborne battalion that had been airlifted in earlier that day by U.S. helicopters. The main South Vietnamese assault along the road had made it halfway to Chapon, facing only light sniper fire from the enemy. Concurrently, ARVN troops on both the northern and southern flanks pressed closer to Aloi. In the north, the 3rd Airborne Brigade set up 2 fire bases, while the 21st and 39th Ranger Battalions established 2 outposts, named Ranger Base South and Ranger Base North, to keep an eye out for any NVA reinforcements coming from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This established a solid network of 4 supportive bases in the northern region. Simultaneously, the ARVN's 1st Infantry Division established 5 fire bases south of Route 9 to protect that flank from enemy attacks. Up to that point, the South Vietnamese forces had made commendable strides against relatively light NVA opposition. However, on February 11th, their advance abruptly stopped. For reasons that were unclear at the time, the ARVN troops halted their offensive. This allowed the North Vietnamese the chance to bring in more reinforcements. There were already elements from 3 infantry regiments, a tank battalion, and an artillery regiment in the vicinity, and the NVA High Command ordered the addition of 4 more infantry regiments and part of a tank regiment to join the fight. As these forces began to converge on the area, the South Vietnamese remained inactive. It became evident that the ARVN needed to regain momentum before the enemy achieved the upper hand, yet Lieutenant General Lam and his senior commanders remained silent. Without orders, the South Vietnamese troops in Laos stayed put. General Abrams was infuriated and traveled to Saigon to speak with General Cao Van Vien, the chairman of the Joint General Staff, urging him to motivate the attackers. On February 16th, Abrams and Sutherland met with Vienne and Lam at Lam's forward command post in Dong Ha. At this meeting, the decision was made to move the 1st ARVN Division further west along the southern escarpment. This was aimed at establishing fire support bases to aid the renewed airborne armored push westward along Route 9 toward Chapone. It was estimated that it would take 3 to 5 days for the 1st Division elements to reach their positions. Although the order was given, the attackers faced a setback. By this time, the NVA had positioned reinforcements to intercept the South Vietnamese advance. The ARVN had lost their initiative and never regained it for the rest of the battle. Following the operation, it became clear that President Thieu influenced the halt of the ARVN attack. On February 12th, he advised Lam to exercise caution while moving west and indicated that if he suffered 3,000 casualties, the operation should be canceled. Thieu was evidently concerned that a high number of casualties in Laos might negatively affect the upcoming national elections in the fall. Additionally, he was worried about losing the ARVN General Reserve, which included the Airborne Division, the 1st Armored Brigade, and the South Vietnamese Marines. These forces served as Thieu's palace guard, safeguarding against potential coups, making him hesitant to risk their destruction. Regardless of Thieu's reasoning, his order effectively ensured that the attack would cease, as ARVN commanders became more focused on minimizing casualties than on continuing the offensive. Once the attack lost its momentum and came to a halt, reigniting it proved nearly impossible. As the South Vietnamese forces' advance stalled along the road, new NVA reinforcements entered the battle area. On February 18th, the 308th NVA Division was first noted in action on the northern flank. The 2nd NVA Division positioned itself in front of the lead ARVN units, and the 24B Regiment of the 305th NVA Division was identified south of Route 9. Alarmingly, ARVN forces began spotting enemy tanks, and an NVA prisoner confirmed the presence of an NVA tank regiment in the vicinity. By early March, North Vietnamese forces outnumbered the South Vietnamese by 2 to 1. Heavy mortar and large-caliber artillery fire intensified against all South Vietnamese positions. The attackers soon found themselves up against a much stronger enemy than they had expected. To exacerbate the situation for the South Vietnamese, sporadic rain and thick fog frequently grounded all aircraft. The few helicopters that managed to take off had to fly at low altitudes, leaving them highly exposed to enemy gunfire. Resupplying the ARVN troops became particularly challenging and perilous in these conditions. On February 19th, Lam and his division commanders convened with President Thieu. Lam updated the president on the situation, highlighting the presence of new NVA units in the vicinity. Thieu instructed Lam to take his time and expand search activities toward the southwest. This order was largely ineffective, as it essentially told Lam to continue with his current approach, which amounted to little action. By February 20th, the South Vietnamese had completely lost the initiative. The NVA launched powerful attacks using Soviet-made T-54 and PT-76 tanks along with heavy artillery, striking hard at the ARVN positions, especially targeting the airborne and ranger units on the northern flank. Almost every South Vietnamese unit soon found themselves engaged in heavy combat. The NVA employed tactics to encircle ARVN positions, sever their air supply lines with intense anti-aircraft fire, and relentlessly bombard them with mortars, rockets, and artillery. They would then assault the positions, often combining infantry and armored forces when possible. The ARVN fought back, but they were often outnumbered and struggled to coordinate their maneuvers with artillery support. Additionally, South Vietnamese artillery had a much shorter range than the NVA's 130mm and 122mm guns, making it difficult to provide effective counterfire. Consequently, the South Vietnamese relied heavily on U.S. close air support and attack helicopters for their survival. Unfortunately, Allied air support proved to be less effective than expected for several reasons. The weather often worsened, leading to grounded helicopters and limited effectiveness for fixed-wing aircraft when they could fly. Moreover, The absence of U.S. advisors meant that airstrikes lacked close coordination. To complicate matters further, the enemy's air defense was denser and more efficient than intelligence had anticipated. The NVA also discovered they could reduce the effectiveness of U.S. air support by positioning themselves close to the ARVN. The American fighter bombers and attack helicopters faced a challenge in targeting the NVA without endangering their South Vietnamese allies. B-52 Arc-Light bombing missions proved effective, but only when the NVA gathered for major assaults. With forces from 4 divisions, the NVA escalated their attacks on South Vietnamese positions. On February 19th, they surrounded the 39th Ranger Battalion at Ranger Base North with more than 2,000 troops. Over 3 days, the NVA relentlessly bombarded the base and chased the Rangers as they tried to escape. Out of the 430 Rangers at the beginning of the battle, 178 were either killed or unaccounted for, and 148 were wounded. Although the 39th was rendered ineffective as a unit, they inflicted significant casualties on the enemy, with reconnaissance photo analysts documenting 639 NVA bodies around Ranger Base North. Next, the NVA focused on Ranger Base South, held by the 21st Battalion and the remaining members of the 39th Battalion. After 2 days of intense combat, Lieutenant General Lamb determined that the Rangers could no longer hold their position and ordered the defenders to retreat to fire support Base 30. This outcome rendered yet another Ranger Battalion combat ineffective and deeply unsettled those who survived. One incident at Ranger Base North shaped the lasting public perception of Lam Son 719. Despite the bravery shown by most Rangers, a few uninjured soldiers panicked and tried to board helicopters evacuating the seriously wounded. Air crews worked to keep these troops in the fight, but some soldiers clung to the helicopter skids, escaping back to South Vietnam. Photos captured these individuals desperately hanging on, creating a lasting image associated with Operation Lam Son 719. Many Americans protested against this portrayal. Lieutenant Colonel Robert F. Molinelli, commander of the 2nd Squadron, 17th Air Cavalry, who provided air support during the battle at Ranger Base North, remarked, "The ARVN Rangers were outnumbered 6 to 8 to 1. For 3 days, we couldn't get them supplies. When ammunition ran low, they seized NVA rifles and continued to fight. When it was time to leave their hill, they fought their way through that North Vietnamese regiment, using their own weapons against them. 17 of their men panicked and clung to helicopter skids, but many more stayed put. Despite reassurances, it was nearly impossible to shake the media's portrayal of ARVN soldiers in a frenzy, fleeing from the communists. As the situation unfolded, President Thieu grew increasingly frustrated with Lieutenant General Lam's indecisiveness and poor handling of the battle. On February 23rd, he called Lieutenant Gen Do Cao Tri, a hero from the Cambodian incursion, from his 3 Corps headquarters to Saigon, handing command of Lam Son 719 to the more assertive Tri. Tragically, as he was leaving Saigon to assume his new role, Tri's helicopter went down, claiming his life. Lieutenant General Lam continued to lead the operation in Laos. The pressure from the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was relentless. On February 25th, they overwhelmed the 3rd Airborne Brigade at Fire Support Base 31, capturing Colonel Nguyen Van Tho and his entire staff. A counterattack by South Vietnam faltered, killing 250 NVA troops and destroying 11 tanks, including PT-76s and T-54s. During the defense and the counterattack at FSB 31, ARVN airborne forces lost 155 men and saw over 100 taken captive. Shortly after, the NVA targeted Fire Support Base 30. The NVA repeated their attack pattern, yielding similar outcomes. Lieutenant General Sutherland expressed his growing concern for the Airborne Division's discipline and morale in a message to General Abrams. He noted Lieutenant General Dong's defeatist mindset, which was mirrored by some of his subordinates. One operation aimed at resupplying FSB 30 and transporting troops saw some success. The wounded and 4 bodies were pulled from the site, while 94 healthy troops, though not all Rangers, rushed to the helicopters. The commander of airborne infantry managed to make it onto the choppers as well. It's rumored that the brigade commander arrived at FSB 30 around 1800 hours to take charge. I fear that before the night ends, the airborne troops might abandon their post. While the South Vietnamese did not leave FSB-30 immediately, it only held out for a few days longer. Eventually, the guns at the firebase were all damaged, prompting orders for the 2nd Airborne Battalion to evacuate. On February 28th, President Thieu inserted himself into the situation once more. He decided that the mission of Lam Son 719 should shift from destroying the NVA base area to taking Chapone, which really held no military significance. This focus on Chapone was merely a public relations tactic, one that would allow Thieu to claim victory and withdraw his forces safely, thus gaining political leverage ahead of the fall elections. As a result, he ordered the Airborne Division to be replaced by the remainder of the Marine Division, which had been relocated to Khe Sanh. The order was absurd. The Airborne Division, while under fire, was still relatively intact, and no solid justification was provided for their replacement. Additionally, the Marine Division had never fought as a complete unit, rendering them an unknown factor. To complicate matters further, switching divisions amid fierce enemy opposition is one of the toughest challenges in modern warfare. Lieutenant General Lam recognized these issues and flew to Saigon to propose an alternative strategy. He suggested to Thieu that the 1st ARVN Infantry Division, bolstered by its 2nd Regiment from its previous position near the DMZ, should assault Chepone via helicopter. The Marine Division would then follow the 1st Division, while the Airborne Division would take on the task of protecting the northern flank. Thieu agreed, and the following day, March 1st, he informed Abrams and Ambassador Bunker of the revised plan. Abrams was displeased with this turn of events. The objective of occupying and destroying the enemy base areas in Laos was abandoned in favor of what he viewed as a pointless action to get South Vietnamese forces into Chepone for political reasons rather than sound military strategy. Nevertheless, Abrams had no choice but to accept Thieu's orders. The NVA had gained the high ground overlooking Route 9 from the north, but they paid a steep price. Repeated B-52 strikes inflicted heavy losses on the North Vietnamese, with MAC-V estimating casualties to be equivalent to one combat-effective NVA regiment each week. This likely prevented the North Vietnamese from gathering enough forces to completely wipe out ARVN units along the highway. From March 3rd to 6th, elements of the 1st ARVN Division carried out a series of helicopter assaults westward along the southern ridge, setting up 3 bases named Lolo, Liz, and Sophia. The NVA put up strong resistance against the 1st Division's advances. 11 helicopters were shot down and 44 others were damaged while bringing ARVN troops into fire support base Lolo. On March 6th, after a fierce bombardment of NVA positions by fighter bombers and B-52s, 2 infantry battalions from the 2nd Regiment of the 1st ARVN Division were airlifted by 120 U.S. UH-1 Huey helicopters from Khe Sanh to LZ Hope, located 4 kilometers northeast of Chapone. On March 7th, South Vietnamese troops entered Chapone, successfully reaching their objective. However, by this time, NVA forces had swelled to 12 infantry regiments, 2 tank battalions, an artillery regiment, and at least 19 anti-aircraft battalions. The South Vietnamese troops in Laos found themselves in a precarious position. On March 9th, Lam returned to meet with Thieu and the leaders of the Joint General Staff, this time advocating for the immediate withdrawal of his forces from Laos. Highlighting the vulnerable position of the ARVN troops, he proposed to extract them by helicopter, starting with the 1st Division, the westernmost unit, followed by the airborne troops, and finally the Marines. General Vien agreed with Lam. However, Abrams and Ambassador Bunker, who were also present, strongly opposed the idea of withdrawal and urged President Thieu to reinforce the beleaguered forces in Laos with the 2nd Infantry Division from Quang Ngai Province and to continue the fight against the Communists. Abrams and Bunker emphasized the importance of political and public relations considerations. Abrams outlined his objections to the withdrawal in a message to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, noting concerns about how a retreat might suggest that RVNF forces had been forced to withdraw despite inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. He highlighted the potential backlash from the South Vietnamese, American, and international press, and how this could affect the political landscape in South Vietnam, particularly with national elections approaching in the fall. However, Chiu was hesitant to risk further casualties, along with the potential loss of his best division, the Airborne Division, and much of his strategic reserve. As a result, he ordered the operation to be terminated and the withdrawal to begin. General Davidson, who served as MAC-VJ-2 at that time, noted that Abrams privately remarked Thieu had lost his resolve and could not forgive him for it. On March 12th, Lieutenant General Lamb started to pull back his troops. This was a tough operation, especially as they were engaged and outnumbered by the enemy. By now, the NVA had deployed 5 divisions to the area to maximize damage to the ARVN. They unleashed severe anti-aircraft fire on the evacuation helicopters, ambushed ARVN units traveling by road, and consistently pressured the South Vietnamese fire bases. The retreat lasted 12 days and was nearly catastrophic. The NVA aimed to encircle and annihilate the South Vietnamese forces, and it was only the support from U.S. tactical air and attack helicopters that prevented total chaos. Airborne and armored units withdrew along Route 9, while those on the flanks were lifted out by U.S. helicopters. The North Vietnamese took every measure to block the South Vietnamese from escaping, chasing them with tanks and other armored vehicles. The chaos that erupted in some South Vietnamese units reminded many of the earlier panic exhibited by Ranger deserters at Ranger Base North. Lt. Col. William N. Preachy, leader of the 158th Aviation Battalion, which provided support missions for South Vietnamese forces during most of Lam Son 719, characterized the withdrawal. The ARVN troops would do anything to escape Laos. The healthy ones would trample over the dead and wounded. We would hover at 6 or 7 feet, and the crew chief and gunner would lie flat, pulling people inside. If you landed on the ground, they would overwhelm the helicopter. Another tactic was to leap onto the shoulders of others and grab onto the skids. The helicopters would ascend to 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and after 5 or 10 minutes, they'd tire and let go. I can still picture the bodies falling through the sky. The last ARVN soldiers made their way back into South Vietnam on March 24th, and the operation was officially concluded on April 6, 1971, 45 days after South Vietnamese forces first entered Laos. Evaluating Lam Son 719 is challenging. On the day his forces reached Chapone, President Thieu declared Lam Son 719 the biggest victory ever, a moral, political, and psychological Dien Bien Phu. The Nixon administration launched a campaign to persuade the American public that the operation had succeeded, even when evidence suggested otherwise. In February, President Nixon claimed, "The operation has gone according to plan," and that ARVN was fighting in a superior way. Administration spokespeople referred to the South Vietnamese withdrawal from Laos as mobile maneuvering. This was clearly an attempt to spin the narrative, yet Nixon clung to the belief that the operation met its objectives, stating in his memoirs, "The net result was a military success but a psychological defeat," attributed to negative TV coverage of the withdrawal. While Nixon's view of the operation invites debate, there's no denying that many in the U.S. media vehemently disagreed with the administration's claims about South Vietnamese performance and the operation's outcomes. James McCartney, writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer, noted that the South Vietnamese have invented a new kind of warfare in Laos. They avoid fighting whenever possible, retreat when the communists appear, and consistently declare victory or success once the operation ends. U.S. military personnel had previously criticized the South Vietnamese for their tendency to retreat during battles, but now, when they fled, Pentagon spokespeople praised their mobility. The Cleveland Plains dealer took a stand against the administration, asserting, "Instead of the military success President Nixon touts, it seems the Laos incursion was a defeat that strengthened Hanoi's resolve." The Philadelphia Bulletin offered a more balanced viewpoint, noting, "Without our air cover and without 51 battalions of U.S. troops holding the fort, one can only speculate how much worse things could have been." Echoing the most critical perspectives from the U.S. media, the North Vietnamese mocked the operation, labeling it the heaviest defeat ever for Nixon and company, a fine example of Vietnamization indeed. An impartial evaluation of the Laotian campaign lies somewhere between Nixon's public statements and the perceptions expressed by the U.S. media. From a strictly military angle, the campaign's outcomes were mixed. Saigon reported that the conflict had resulted in 1,160 government troops killed, 4,071 wounded, and 240 reported missing. However, many media outlets, including the Associated Press and Newsweek, disputed these numbers, claiming the actual toll was 3,800 killed, 5,200 wounded, and 775 missing. Official figures from the 14th Corps, which were quite similar to those published by the media, indicated that casualties in Saigon included 9,000 killed, wounded, or captured, translating to a casualty rate of nearly 50%. U.S. losses included 253 killed or missing in action and 1,149 wounded. In terms of equipment, the U.S. lost 108 helicopters destroyed and 618 damaged, with around 20% expected to never fly again. The U.S. Air Force lost 7 fighter bombers and saw the deaths of 4 pilots in action. Meanwhile, the ARVN lost 211 trucks, 87 combat vehicles, 54 tanks, 96 artillery pieces, and all the combat engineer equipment that had accompanied the attacking forces. Allies reported a staggering 19,043 enemy killed, along with 1,123 crew served and 3,045 individual weapons captured, and significant losses of tanks, artillery pieces, munitions, and rice. While these figures are striking, it's essential to recognize that they mostly came during the earlier stages of the campaign, before the South Vietnamese lost their initiative. Despite the losses suffered by the North Vietnamese and the enemy supplies that were captured or destroyed, the combat performance of the South Vietnamese forces had been erratic at best. President Nixon, attempting to maintain an optimistic outlook on what was clearly a troubling performance, praised the South Vietnamese for their efforts against the best the North could muster. He stated, "General Abrams says that some units did not perform exceptionally well, but 18 out of 22 battalions demonstrated high morale and confidence, able to hold their ground against the North Vietnamese." This viewpoint is, at best, debatable. Some units did indeed fight valiantly, yet others, including some elite forces, faltered and retreated under the intense pressure of the NVA. The weaknesses of the South Vietnamese were glaringly apparent. Once again, the politicized senior leadership posed a significant challenge. Lieutenant General Lam was the overall ground commander, but the commanders of the airborne and marine divisions largely disregarded Lam, both being lieutenant generals themselves, more familiar with addressing Saigon directly than responding to a corps commander. They challenged Lam's orders at every turn. Despite Lam seeking support from President Chio opted not to reprimand Lam's subordinate commanders, even when their actions neared insubordination during intense fighting. He was hesitant to offend the two generals, one leading his main anti-coup force, the airborne, and the other overseeing much of his strategic reserve. Once again, political issues overshadowed military needs. Lam was not particularly distinguished himself. As General Bruce Palmer noted after the war, Lam had a mediocre reputation as a combat leader, but was seen as a loyal and capable administrator. Before Lam Son 719, he managed to maintain his position as corps commander through his political savvy and support for President Tu. However, he lacked experience in managing large-scale conventional operations. The fierce combat in Laos and the operations' demands proved overwhelming for him. Lieutenant Colonel Darren from the Z-14 Corps headquarters shared his insights about Lam's conduct during the operations, recalling, "I recall seeing him one morning toward the end of the operation when things were going badly in Laos. He was reclined, almost in a crucified posture, leaning against his bunker, looking up at the sky with his eyes shut, clearly under immense strain. Honestly, I felt he was just out of his depth." Lam's shortcomings were clear throughout the operation. Brigadier General Sidney B. Berry, the assistant commander of the 101st Airborne Division, reported after the operation that planning and coordination for Lam Son 719 were unacceptably low at the corps commander's level. Lam was ill-prepared to handle an operation as extensive and complex as Lam Son 719, but he wasn't the only one. Unfortunately for the South Vietnamese, the lack of adequate planning and coordination extended beyond just the corps commander level. ARVN commanders at every level faced significant challenges in command and control, especially in coordinating combined arms operations. The ability to effectively use infantry, armor, and artillery together, along with the smart deployment of reserve forces, was crucial. General Vian, who led the RVNF Joint General Staff, highlighted the impact of these challenges. Our armored force, consisting of 300 vehicles, found itself in difficult terrain, rendering it ineffective against enemy tanks. It couldn't support the airborne division in breaking the enemy's encirclement or regaining control. Meanwhile, the enemy's armor was bold and menacing, using its knowledge of the terrain to set traps and close in on our positions, ultimately combining with infantry to launch assaults and overrun our defenses. Our infantry units avoided maneuvers during engagements and failed to effectively utilize their own firepower, depending solely on external support. Although the I Corps and division commanders had reserve forces, they didn't utilize them to address challenges and reclaim the initiative. Even our available firepower wasn't used effectively, especially in the early phase of the operation, due to a lack of coordination. The absence of U.S. advisors became increasingly evident as coordination difficulties plagued the South Vietnamese forces. Many responsibilities that ARVN commanders usually handled with the help of U.S. advisors were either neglected or executed poorly. Army Chief of Staff William Westmoreland noted that, having been accustomed to working with American advisors, subordinate ARVN commanders struggled to arrange fire support and resupply without assistance. The senior American advisor and the overall ARVN commander were operating from different locations. Several senior ARVN commanders faltered, which prompted President Thieu to step in and start issuing orders down to the regiment level, often without General Abrams being informed. A significant concern for MATV was the South Vietnamese forces' inability to coordinate their fire support, leading to a heavy dependence on U.S. support. Many within both MATV and the RVNF Joint General Staff recognized that U.S. air support was essential in preventing a complete rout in Laos. Despite facing fierce anti-aircraft fire and ground attacks, U.S. Army helicopters conducted over 160,000 sorties, and U.S. tactical aircraft carried out more than 10,000 strikes in support of South Vietnamese forces. The South Vietnamese reliance on U.S. air support was profound. The support from the U.S. would vanish once the troop withdrawals were finalized, which posed a significant challenge for the ARVN. If they couldn't secure their own fire support, the North Vietnamese would take advantage once the Americans left. One of the most impactful consequences of Lam Son 719 was its damaging effect on the morale and spirit of the South Vietnamese. Despite President Thieu's grand statements, the South Vietnamese forces that retreated from Laos recognized their defeat. U.S. Marine Corps Advisor Maj. William Dabney, who coordinated operations from the air, remarked on the stark difference in the Vietnamese Marines' demeanor before and after the operation, stating, "These were brave men, well-led, well-supplied, full of aplomb and self-assurance when they entered. But when they exited, they had been beaten. They knew it, and they acted like it." During the chaotic retreat from Laos, many South Vietnamese soldiers lost their lives on the battlefield. One ARVN officer later captured the trauma. This was a horrific burden for those families left behind who, due to their deep-rooted traditions honoring the dead and caring for the living, were left in endless grief and uncertainty. Vietnamese sentiment would never forget. While Thieu proclaimed a victory, the soldiers and their families understood the harsh reality of their failure and felt deeply demoralized by what they perceived as a clear defeat by the North Vietnamese forces. In an effort to combat plummeting morale, Thieu banned U.S. magazines like Time and Newsweek and silenced several opposition papers that highlighted the operation's unfavorable aspects. He also kept the severely impacted airborne and marine divisions in I Corps instead of sending them back to their usual bases in Saigon, wanting to prevent them from sharing stories of the near catastrophe in Laos. Regardless, the morale and confidence of the South Vietnamese had taken a serious hit. Clearly, Lam Son 719 represented a setback for the ARVN and a blow to Vietnamization, yet it did manage to meet some of the original objectives. In late March, Lieutenant General Sutherland shared this evaluation with Abrams. Lam Son 719 has incurred high costs in terms of U.S. support, but its accomplishments thus far suggest the damage dealt to the enemy, the disruption of their planned offensive actions, the indications of the Vietnamization program's success, and the future advantages gained all point to this operation as being incredibly valuable and productive. Sutherland may have exaggerated his assessment of the operation, and his views on Vietnamization are open to challenge. Yet there's significant proof that Lam Son 719 at least momentarily hindered the North Vietnamese army's buildup in Laos. While South Vietnamese forces faced heavy losses, the North Vietnamese were hit hard as well, with some reports suggesting they lost up to half of their troops deployed for this operation. Even if those estimates are on the high side, it's evident that the operation cost the Communists significantly in personnel and equipment, resources they likely would have used in a major offensive against military Region 1 later in 1971. Consequently, Lam Son 719 played a crucial role in delaying the next big communist onslaught, as it took the North Vietnamese nearly a year to replace the soldiers and equipment lost while trying to undermine the South Vietnamese along Route 9. This provided the South Vietnamese and the Vietnamization process with a much-needed pause from NVA pressure. As Keith Nolan pointed out in Into Laos, Vietnamization had been tested, had strained but not cracked, and now had room to grow. Right after Lam Son 719 ended, President Nixon stated, "Tonight I can report that Vietnamization has succeeded." He then declared he would speed up the withdrawal of U.S. troops, bringing home an additional 100,000 by November 1971. He pledged that American involvement in Vietnam was coming to an end, but he declined to specify a total withdrawal date, explaining that doing so would compromise our principal bargaining chip to secure the release of American prisoners of war, and would remove the enemy's strongest incentive to negotiate an end to the war sooner. The intended withdrawals would leave 184,000 American troops in South Vietnam by the close of 1971. In June 1971, Secretary of Defense Laird announced that 90% of combat responsibility had been transferred to the ARVN, and 2 months later, confirmed that Phase 1 of Vietnamization was complete. This indicated that from that point on, ground combat responsibility would be fully taken on by the RVNAF. Despite the administration's claims regarding the success of Lam Son 719, the operation raised significant doubts about Phase 2 of Vietnamization. During this phase, the South Vietnamese were expected to build their own air and naval support systems, along with artillery, logistics, and maintenance systems to replace those supplied by the United States since 1965. The timeline for achieving this was uncertain, but Lam Son 719 clearly showed that the RVNF still had a considerable way to go before reaching the ultimate goal of self-sufficiency in combat. It was recognized that as the South Vietnamese pursued this aim, the U.S. would still need to provide a degree of combat support, especially air power, which had been crucial in Laos, even as it gradually withdrew the remaining American ground troops. General Philip Davidson described the situation in 1971 by noting that Lam Son 719 highlighted the progress made in Vietnamization, yet also revealed significant weaknesses within the South Vietnamese government and its military that indicated achieving final success was still many years, if not decades, away. Ultimately, the operation illustrated the ARVN's complete reliance on U.S. forces.